And hello to everyone watching. Welcome to tonight's Barnes& Noble virtual event. We're having a conversation with author V.E. Schwab. My name is Kayti Burt, and I am the book's editor at denofgeek.com, as well as a V.E. Schwab fan, which I think some of you can relate to. For those of you who aren't yet V.E. Schwab fans or who perhaps need a recap, given the sheer amount of storytelling Victoria manages to produce in any given year, here is a brief bio. Victoria is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of more than a dozen books, including The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, the Shades of Magic series, the Villain series, which we'll be talking about tonight, This Savage Song, and Our Dark Duet, which is only some of them. Her work has received critical acclaim, been featured in the New York Times, Entertainment Weekly, Washington Post, and more. It has been translated into more than a dozen languages, which is so cool, and has been optioned for both television and film. So welcome to Victoria. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for chatting with me. Apologies in advance for the kittens, which have decided that this is their time. They have been sleeping for the last 5 hours and they are awake now. So sorry.
No apologies necessary. That is a feature, not a bug.
Yes.
So you have Extraordinary coming out tomorrow, November 23rd, which is a graphic novel that is set between your books Vicious and Vengeful, aka the Villains series. And just for those who maybe aren't familiar with the world of Villains, can you explain what sets this fictional world apart from the one you and I live in?
It's a world very much like ours, actually. The only real difference is that it's a world in which sometimes, under very specific circumstances, near-death experiences can lead to supernatural abilities. And these people with supernatural abilities are called EOs, extraordinaries. And so the books start around Victor and Eli, the two young men who essentially, while in college, just make this discovery and set out to manufacture their own deaths or manufacture their own powers by using their own deaths and resurrections. And so this graphic novel is set in the time between Vicious and Vengeful. And while it does feature one of them, it mostly focuses on Charlotte Tills, who's a 16-year-old girl who has been in a bus crash and now has the ability to see other people's deaths in reflective surfaces. But she looks into her own reflection and sees her murderer in the form of Eli, who's one of the main characters from the books. And so it essentially is about her setting out to change her fate, or to see if she can change her fate before it catches up with her.
So, and by some metric, this is the 4th story you've written in this world. You also had a short story that is part of the exclusive edition that everyone at tonight's event will be getting. But when you first started writing Vicious, which came out in 2013, did you imagine it as a world, or did you imagine it as a story? Or is that not even a distinction for you?
I mean, I didn't even imagine it as a book, because when I started writing Vicious, like my career was early on, but it wasn't going well at all. And essentially I had fallen out of love with writing, had fallen out of love with the creative side of publishing. And so I just wanted to do something that made me happy. And I kind of hit that point where I was like, well, if my books aren't going to sell, at least I'm going to enjoy writing and reading them. So what do I want to read? And in retrospect, it feels like a very obvious question to ask oneself, but I don't think authors, we don't always do it. We think about like, what does the market want? What do readers want? But at the end of the day, you can't control any of those factors. You can control an audience of one, and that is you. And so I asked myself, like, what do I want to read? If no one was reading me, which very might be the case soon, what would I want to read? And like, I have always loved comic books, and I have always loved superhero and villain stories. I'm obviously more drawn to the villains. I think I was really interested in this concept of hero and villain as like arbitrary labels. So I started looking at like, could I write a book with no heroes and still make the reader root for somebody? And so it really started out as just like a creative exercise. I would end up writing Vicious over the course of 3 years without telling anybody. And it wasn't until the book was finished that I thought, okay, well, that's done what I needed it to do for me. So now I'll see if anyone else wants to read it. So in a weird way, like comic books inspired the book, which then inspired the comic. So it's been very full circle. And now it's very much feels like a world that's inhabited by multiple forms of storytelling, but it didn't start out that way.
A cat sighting.
Going to kill that cat. Honestly. Just trying to get it out of the window at this point. I'm just trying to get it out of the window. Come on. There we go.
I didn't know there was going to be sound effects.
Yeah. Yes. Apologies.
So where did ExtraOrdinary come into that? Like, where did that idea of creating not only a comic series, but a story that was set between these two books start?
Well, it's so interesting because in a lot of ways, I mean, the whole process of writing the stories in this world has been less straight line and more spherical, if you will. And I say that because when I very first started writing Vicious, it was a completely different book. It was a completely different narrative. And it started with a character at the very heart of it who had the ability to see deaths in reflective surfaces.
Oh, and I didn't know that.
It was a guy, and he had been in a train crash, because it was all about that moment when you're on a train and you can see outside the train and inside the train at the same time, and it feels like you're seeing two worlds. And for those who don't know, this near-death experience, it's caused by not only the circumstances of your near-death, but also your psychology at the moment, your last thoughts. And so the circumstances in that way inspire your thinking, which can help shape your power. And so, yeah, it was originally Vicious wasn't about Victor and Eli. It was about this dude who went to a city to try and find what he saw in his visions, and ended up being recruited by two rival groups, the heroes and the villains. And Victor and Eli, and they were just arbitrary names. You ended up on one team because someone you hated was on the other side. So it was really just this random. And it was only when I stopped to go like write the backstory for the leaders of these two groups, the heroes and the villains, Victor and Eli, that I became more interested in their story. And so I let go of the guy, but I kept holding on to his power. Sometimes I'll pocket a power and I'll be like, I got to use for that later. So I was really, really intrigued by that. And then there's a 5-year gap between Vicious and Vengeful, and there will be at least a 5-year gap between Vengeful and Victorious, the third book. And so I just started thinking there's an interesting landscape where I knew where all my main characters were in those 5 years, and I didn't want to do anything to disrupt the line of their narrative. I didn't want to end up retconning anything. I didn't want to do anything to break the worlds, but there was space in there to have a new character. And of course, I didn't want to write something that didn't in any way intersect the books, because I wanted there to at least be appearances. And so Eli finds himself in captivity for a 5-year period. It's kind of a perfect storm to include him without breaking the line of his narrative between Vicious and Vengeful.
Did you always know that you needed this other character who is Charlotte to tell the story? And also, why Charlotte? Like, why is she the character who is the protagonist here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I was a very morbid teenager. I'm a very morbid adult, but I was like super death obsessed as a teenager. And all I could think to like make teenage years more traumatic would be to like grant you the ability to see the deaths of everyone you love all the time. And so I feel like teen years are already very fraught. We're already like caught between a sense of an immortality complex and then a kind of fragility for everything. And everything is a 10. There's no like...
That was athletic.
that cat. One of the cats is essentially just like a sea anemone, and the other one is a ferret. And I wish that the sea anemone was leading the show right now. But yeah, and so I just I kind of wanted to now. Thanks, Thomas. Lost it.
Thomas,
please repeat the end of that question.
So Charlotte as a character.
Yes. Which is that when you're a teenager, everything already feels catastrophic. Like that's why I love writing teenagers, is like, especially because I write fantasy or write speculative. So you're already the world already feels like it's ending. Every little decision feels like it has massive consequences. And in my world, they often do. So it's like, take the 16-year-old and make life even more angst inducing. But what I love about Charlotte is another person would have seen what she did in her reflection and done everything in her power to avoid that fate. But Charlotte is the kind of teenager where she goes out and she's going to interrupt it. And of course, a character asks over the course of the graphic novel, like, are you not just self-fulfilling? Like, at what point by seeking out your fate are you affecting your fate? And that's one of the big thoughts. And someone asked me recently, and I thought this was really interesting, that like Vicious is it's a very masculine book. And it is really about like men taking power. And then Vengeful is in a lot of ways, a feminine book in that it's about men, those same men losing power and women reclaiming their power. And this book is about fate and kind of like the idea of, so you have power, what is power? Like, what is a superpower if it doesn't allow you to change anything? Because that's one of the questions at the heart of Charlotte's narrative. Okay, you can see death, but death is always there. So sure, what if you change the nature of someone's reflection? You change the image in it. What if by changing the image in it, you advance their death 10 years? What if by changing in it, you set off another catastrophe? What if, so it's really just this question of like, what is power? And can you ever really have control? And so control has kind of been, control and power are such guiding principles throughout the books that I wanted to explore it in a different way in the comics, which is to say, like, do you ever really have power?
Cool. Comic books are usually a collaborative process, and you have a partner in telling the story in Enid Balam, who is the illustrator. What did that process look like in terms of finding someone to do the art for this? Is that something that you were involved in, or? Yeah.
Always. I mean, it's a very collaborative process, and it's really important to have a good working relationship, to have a good common language that you're working with, to make sure that you're on the same stylistic page. So yeah, there's an auditioning process where we create a short list of like 6 to 10 illustrators. And then basically I go through and I start looking for, okay, well, this is a story with superpowers and a huge amount of like action sequences and fight scenes. So I am looking for artists who are really skilled at dynamism, who are really skilled at movement. And so you start looking for like, who's going to best complement the kind of story I'm going to tell. And I loved Enid's samples. I loved his work. And then it's really interesting because your relationship with your illustrator changes over the course of writing the issues. So the first issue in a lot of ways becomes a proving ground, becomes a way for you to test and see like, okay, well, how much do I need to dictate to get what I want out of it? And so I, over the course of writing an entire graphic novel, the goal is how much creative room can I give my artist? Like, what can I do to allow him to shine? Because I obviously know what my strengths are, but like, I am relying on the artist to bring this to life. I mean, it is not a 50-50 when it comes to comics. I would argue it is like very much you learning how to really embolden each other and make space for each other's creativity. And every now and then there will be a scene that I articulate really specifically. I'll be like, I want my panel to look exactly like this, and I will stipulate. But more often than not, I will try in as many places as possible to find freedom for Enid to create the kind of flow that he's good at doing. So I love it because I write novels 90% of the time, and it's very solitary, it's very lonely, and the editing process is nice, but like for the amount that you're drafting, I swear to God, this cat, for the amount that you're drafting, like you're really alone. And if you don't state it, it's not on the page, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful, almost living document quality to a comic script, much like a TV script or a film script, where you're making something to be interpreted. And that's so deeply exciting. So I would get pages back every few days, and it would be like getting professionally commissioned fan art. Like I'm just being like, here's what I want to see. I'm about to put the cat in another room. It's fine. Here's what I want to see. And then like the art comes in, the line art comes in, and the color work comes in, and I'll weigh in on the sketches and then on the line art. And it's so deeply cool. Like, it's so like this came in the mail today, and it's like the full piece of art.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And like, in what world would I just get to be like, oh yeah, like that's inspired by Charlotte Tills, and it's like an abstract interpretation of time and fate, like flowing around her.
It seems like something you've always appreciated, because I do see you posting a lot of fan art on your Instagram and on Twitter. So it's cool that you are so excited about that part of, yeah, like seeing people interpret your work.
It's weird because, and maybe, I don't know, I need to ask my author friends I don't know. Every now and then I think like, oh, well, this is normal. And then I'll find out that like one author has no visual concept in his head while he's writing. Like he doesn't even picture the space or how they move. Or and I'm like, for me, regardless of what I'm writing, I'm playing a movie in my head. And then for me, the act of storytelling is writing down a script so that other people read it and play the exact same movie in their head. Just like a very specific way to think about it. But like, I want you to have the color palette and the style and the tone and the film score, all of these things. And so it's weird to have artwork, to have fan art, or to have professionally articulated work like ExtraOrdinary, because it's such a gift. And it also to me is a litmus test as to whether I am creating the movie that I'm trying to create. When I see a character art comes back and every version of them, they look the same no matter who's drawing them, then I did a good job of articulating the movie. When there's a lot of differentiation and character interpretation, that means that like I either dropped a stitch or I was too ambiguous, or if I've done it on purpose, then it's cool to see the different interpretations.
Yeah, I was curious because I'd seen you mention before that you really want to give the artists that you work with as much creative freedom as possible, because this isn't, you know, the first time that you've worked with someone and creating a graphic novel of an already existing world that you've created. But I was curious if there was anything within the villains world that you were like, no, this has to be this though. Like this has to be this color. This has to look like this.
Honestly, the only time it came to that, I kind of lost. And the reason is like people will see there is an issue that deals a lot in flashback with Victor and Eli. Now, Victor is known in the books to only wear black, but having flat black clothes is not great in a comic. Like it is difficult. It starts to create like very two-dimensional space. And so he is done in like dark grayscale. And it drives me crazy, not because it's not gorgeous, it's beautiful, but I'm like, no, Victor wears black. And they would come back and they'd be like, here's charcoal. And I'm like, this is not black. Like, this is not black. Like he's wearing like this, he might as well be wearing colors. And it was one of those things where I was just like, I'm going to lose this fight because it's a difference of articulation for the style here. Like given the kind of color pop that this comic has, it would have been so discordant. But no, I mean, it was really cool to see what Enid did with the reflections, because like what a nightmare. I'm like, okay, great. Every time there's a reflection in any surface, we need to see someone dying in it. You have to not only design the scenes as they would be, but you need to always make sure that we know exactly what could be a reflective surface at all times. And like that I felt bad for, because I was like, I'm so sorry. But literally anytime Charlotte's in the frame and we have reflective surfaces, we're going to need to see something in the reflection.
I want to remind people who are watching that they can submit questions and using the Q&A function. We're going to have some time later to answer those, as well as the ones that you submitted when you registered for the event. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask you about, this is a broad question, but obviously our culture is very into stories about people with superpowers.
Yeah, I've picked up on that. I mean, I've noticed it. I've noticed it recently.
I don't know if you have. Yeah. And this is a story about people with superpowers. And I was curious if you'd thought about, you know, this is a big question that I think about a lot and don't necessarily have an answer to, like why our culture cares about stories about superheroes or superpowered people. And if you don't have an answer to that, why did you want to tell a story about superpowered people?
I think there's a huge degree of wish fulfillment, and I don't mean it just for the heroes. I think there's this concept that like we find wish fulfillment through the heroes, but I found writing a lot of antagonists, most of the time we find wish fulfillment through the villains, because there's like a moral imperative that seems to come with heroes. And I don't know about you, but I think one of the things that sets Vicious apart is like, I very much decided that when a person got superpowers, they didn't become a superhero. There is no moral imperative that comes with the acquisition of superpowers. You're suddenly just a person with powers. And kind of the thesis statement across all of my work is that power makes you worse. That like when you have power, you have all of the baggage that you had before power, all of the jealousy, all of the spite, all of the ambition, all of the covetousness, all of the vice. And suddenly you have a way to act on it. And so I'm really fascinated by the idea of, I don't even separate it into hero and villain. It's just power. I think we crave the ability to act out. I think we feel impotent so often in our lives. I think we feel like we just really wish that we could move mountains with our emotions, with our anger, with our resentment, with our like the pent upness of it all. And if you think about what a power is, it's an expression of that. It's an outlet, it's a release. And I think so often we just want someone to have a release. And sure, I think there's a whole different argument to be made for heroes that's like about seeing the best in the world and like helping positive change. But I tend to not write about those. I tend to write about the expression of antagonism. And what I've found is that that speaks to readers, because when we look at a character, I don't think we relate to the good in them. I think we relate to the shortcomings. I don't think we often look at a character and we're like, that character's a badass. I'm a badass. Therefore, I relate to that character. We see a person who's hurting. We see a person who's suffering in some way. We see a person who's falling short. I think those are the ones we see as mirrors. And so I think that power and superpowers, it's like just an amplification tool for all of the things that we're feeling. It's a catharsis.
Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna think about that.
I just want everyone watching to know it is 12:30 in the morning here. So if any of my sentences don't make sense at this point, it's because I was up at 7, which is like a normal time for other people, but it's not a normal time for me.
You're doing great. I did want to get a chance to ask some audience questions. I'm going to give the name of people who submitted, because I think these are some really good questions. I may butcher some pronunciation, so I apologize ahead of time. So from Anna Ivandidi, they asked, what gave you the idea of Victor? And also, did you ever think about making Victor and Eli an enemies to lovers story?
Oh, God. I'm not like saying, oh, God, because no, I'm just saying, oh, God, because the answer is so narcissistic. Okay, go back to remember when I said that no one was ever going to read Vicious.
Yeah,
it was just a catharsis tale. So Victor and Eli are both based on different versions of me. Much more Victor than Eli. My name is Victoria Elizabeth. Victor and Eli. The day that my editor happened to ask me what my initials stood for, she was shocked and appalled. She was like, "I'm sorry, did you literally name both leads for yourself?" What I'll say is Victor is, up until Henry Strauss in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, Victor is the most autobiographical character I've ever written. My friends and family always like me to stipulate that I am not a serial killer, because like, I don't mean it in that way. What I mean is like, I grew up as an only child and I felt like an outsider, and I was a very keen observer, and I was a social mimic. And in a lot of ways I was Victor. Like, I just felt like I was just a watcher in my life. And so I wrote Victor for me. I mean, he was just me. It's really interesting because the other part of that question makes me think about romance in general. And something that a lot of people who read my books will comment on is the lack of it. And I don't actually think my books lack romance. What I think it is that so often when there's a romance in a story, the romance becomes the loudest relationship by default. And I don't like that, because there are so many cooler kinds of relationship than romance. There's antagonism, and there's allies, and there's siblings, and there's, so many kinds of dynamics. I think Victor and Eli have a really interesting dynamic. And I think it's a disservice to that dynamic to label it romance, because it's obsession. And I think so often we don't realize that obsession is a facet of other things, a facet of other relationships, but it can also exist unto itself. There is a degree of desire to subsume each other's lives. Like, there is a very complex rivalry and a longing to embody the other's identity there. And no, it's not romance, but I would absolutely say what Victor and Eli have is obsession.
Yeah. I just want to think about everything. I'm just like, okay, I'm going to go off and think about that. But I'm like, no, next question.
There's a lot I do think I would always challenge people to it's really interesting to find the things which happen in the absence of romance. like to find all of the other dynamics which get to breathe. Like Extraordinary has a really strong found family aspect to it. And I will say that like found family is a dynamic that plays in Vicious as well. And it's something that interests me because a found family creates a variety of dynamics within its own environment. Each coupling within a found family has their own dynamic in addition to the kind of ensemble effect of it all.
Yeah. And I think like the romance genre in general is like, at least there's this idea, and I think there's a real basis to it, of romance being one of the only like mainstream genres that was made by and for women.
Yeah.
And I think it's so much about interpersonal relationships, not just romance, but like there is a hierarchy within like the tropes of that genre. And I hope we're like moving out of that. But I understand why some people can like, yeah, that's like the story language we have, I think, for like a lot of emotional storytelling.
Absolutely. And I also think that for my own stories, usually the stakes are so high and the times are so dark that it would feel disingenuous to prioritize a romance. Because for me, the romance is like the happily ever after. It's the thing you get after the battles are won. And most of my characters are battling something really intense at the time. And so it's not like a devaluation of romance. It's like a desire for it not to be hierarchically defaulted as the most important.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Oh my God. Can I just say it's finally down? Like it finally stopped moving. So let's just take a moment. Let's all appreciate that.
I feel like you're tempting fate right now, but we'll see.
I mean, the other, so I don't know if you can see, the other one is now crashed out on that. So it's great.
They're tired. They wore themselves out.
Long night. It's been a long night.
So, Tammy Lind asks, how do you know when to stop editing?
I mean, I don't. Like, there are deadlines and people take the book away. What I'll say is like, I spend a lot of time with stories before I start writing them. I will spend like anywhere from 1 to 4 years with an idea, letting it get richer, kind of turning it over. I always use like a food analogy. So like steeping on the stove. My stories steep for a long time. And I think because I spend so much time with them in the beginning, I know when to let them go. And it's always like a very deeply specific thing for me. So I'm not sure how much it applies. I can't really apply to anyone else, but there's a moment in revising, and perhaps it's less applicable to the comics because that's just more like you go through your sets with the comics and I don't have full control. Like I can't sit there and nitpick over a line the way that the artist can. But on the novel side, something happens towards the very end of revision where I read what I've written and I don't feel like I wrote it. It's a level of dissonance, a detachment, and it only comes at the very end of the creative process. And I have this weird, because I have such a like self-loathing creative cycle where instead I have this like momentary elation because I'm reading it like a reader. And then right on the tail of that is a terror of like, past me was obviously a better writer because I couldn't write this as present. Like I immediately tailspin out that I will never write anything that good again. That's when I know it's done. Like I know it's done because I don't feel like I own it anymore. I don't feel like I am capable of doing it anymore. It belongs to a past version of me. It is not mine anymore. So I think but I do think you can cultivate a gut sense. The more, I mean, you have to remember, I'm 21 books in now. Like you cultivate along the way a sense of your own work and a sense of your improvement and an understanding that like you will always be able to change a word here or there in your head. You will always go back to your work after it's published and be like, I would pick a different synonym. At that point, you're done. Like when you're moving a comma back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, you're not making it better. You're just making it different. And so I think cultivating in that sense when you've actually finished doing the work.
We have another process question from Erin Miles, who asks, what does your brainstorming process look like? And there's more. Favorite beverage to have on hand while writing your mysteries? Do you prefer writing pen and paper, a typewriter, or computer, or do you dictate your books? Which I didn't even think of as an option. But it is.
The only time I dictate notes is when it's like I'm literally like in the car or I am it's so late at night that the idea of typing it into my notes app is abhorrent. Usually I'll do it with like one eye open at like 2 a.m. It's so bad. No, so okay, let me break this down. I only ever drink black tea while I'm writing. I will usually, much to like my coffee shop's chagrin, go through like 3 to 4 pots of it. They're like, they've like told me the other day, they're like, this is really nice tea. And I'm like, I'm enjoying it. And they're like, do you want to try a different kind of tea? Because I think I'm literally going through their entire supply at this point of like English breakfast, but I have a pot of black tea while I'm working. I like don't really eat anything, like I stop and snack. But when I'm writing, I usually write in like 20-minute speed rounds, and I'll do that for 2 to 3 hours. And so like, I don't do anything that interrupts that besides tea. I brainstorm for a really long time. Like I said before, I am an outliner. I'm a planner. Now that process changes a little bit with each book. Like there are some books where like my next novel, Gallant, I knew every single scene in the order it was going to be. And I wrote the book beginning to end, which is never. Most of the time I use Scrivener, which allows you to kind of like create documents within your documents so that it doesn't crash the way that Word does. I have crashed Word. I get up to about 49 open files on Word, and Word's like, I'm out, I'm done. But I will say, like, I will never start writing a book until I know how it ends. Because that for me is the thing I'm working toward. Not, I need to know exactly where all the characters are, psychologically, if not physically. And I know what the end scene is. Because for me, to carry on that food analogy, it's like, it's like the last bite. It's the last thing, it's the taste. I think we retcon as consumers of all media. When something ends well, like we love it more. And you could have had like an amazing thing that botched its ending, and I think we will love it less. We don't proportionally rank things that way. I think we have a disproportionate emphasis on the ending. So, and I'm very proud of my endings, but also, again, coming back to neuroses, having an ending I'm excited by is the only thing that keeps me from quitting along the way because of how much I hate first drafts. And so like, I need to have an ending that I'm so confident in that even on the worst writing days, I won't delete my book. Cause I'm like, you just got to get to the ending that you know is good. Yeah. So I really have like, I would say probably 10 to 20 of the scenes that I want, like important scenes, beats, sometimes just a visual or an action that I'm excited by, and the ending before I ever put pen to paper to find things like the voice, the tense points of view. I can't remember. Oh, I plot longhand and I type. So I cannot, I'm such a neurotic writer. I also come from a poetry background. And what that means for me personally is that if I'm not excited about the words on the page, I can't keep going. So I can't do like a zero draft or a NaNoWriMo where it's just like get something down on paper to make it better. And I just find I'm such a reviser of my sentences as I go that it's just not efficient to have it in written form. I need to type, but I will plot almost exclusively longhand. So like doing the actual, it's different part of your brain, doing the actual cogs turning plotting of like the choose your own adventure of what can happen next ideas, that's all longhand. And then the actual words that you as the reader read is all typed.
Cool. That makes sense to me, like breaking up that process in different ways.
I think longhand is less precious in a weird way. Typing feels very official. Whereas I have such horrific handwriting that my like notes basically self-destruct after a day.
Like they're secrets.
I can't read my own notes after 24 hours. And so for me, it's just like, we're just jotting.
Yeah. Joanne Wong asks, will there be any comic additions to your other series or standalones that you have written? So have you considered other graphic novel? Yeah.
Not right now, because there's The Steel Prince, which is 3 volumes, and that is a prequel to Shades of Magic. It's set when King Maxim was a prince, when he was Maresh's age. And then this one, honestly, like I have a graphic novel idea, but it's a graphic novel, not a comic. And I kind of just like want to write the whole thing, but not in terms of graphic novel inserts into my other worlds at the moment. But that's also just because I have like 6 books that are due.
You're busy.
Busy. What can I say?
We have another question
Yeah.
from Julie Conlin who asks, what was the hardest scene to create in Extraordinary and why?
Ooh, um, hardest scene. I mean, the problem is the hardest scenes are also my most favorite. I mean, really, the whole comic is working towards the inevitable collision of Charlotte and Eli. Like from the moment Charlotte sees Eli in her reflection, that's the promise we've set up with the comic. So the most daunting and most exciting scene is obviously the moment where that collision finally takes place. And I mean, it's so interesting because like I also know how I would have written it in novel form. And it's like so different from how you do it in comic form. It's like the only, here's what I'll say is the only scene I wish I could have written in novel form, because I like wanted to make it even bigger and like linger. And I think that's one of the strangest difficulties, the ones maybe the least expected difficulties when you're coming from novels to comics, is that in books, a chapter is as long as I need it to be. A book is up to a limit as long as I need it to be. In comics, it is rigid. There were definitely times where I'm like, I could have really used an extra page here. And it's like,
and they're like, that's not how it works.
That's you genuinely can't have. That's, I think if I do again, I think one of the reasons that I really want to do just a graphic novel, because you have a little bit more flexibility of length. But it's truly the only scene where I'm like, I could have used like, we told all the story we needed to. It would have been purely atmospheric indulgence to have more pages of that interaction. And also what I'll say is, like, we have not seen the last of any of the characters that are in this comic. Like, there's something that happens at the very end of the comic that should suggest who and how will play a role in the third villain's book. So like, we're not gonna see last. So I'm actually like, maybe I'll do a flashback version of it at some point in Victorious, where I actually get to like write out the novel version of the collision between Charlotte and Eli, because cool. I still am like, I want to do that one more.
So I'm very excited for Victorious. Yeah. And I was curious if writing Extraordinary kind of changed or inspired anything that you weren't expecting in that.
Probably like C plots. Like I have all the A plots for Victorious, mostly because like I outlined it already. Because it was always meant to be 3 books in my head, I would say that I know all the main characters' directions. But there's definitely space for some interruptions and complications along the way. And so it was really interesting to introduce a character like Charlotte and then ask myself, okay, what are the different ways that Charlotte's narrative could go in the third book?
We have a question from Abina Duncan, who asks, what one feeling or thought do you hope people walk away with after reading Extraordinary?
Well, it's always, thank you, Chauncey. It's always my goal to like make people question morality a little bit. And I think with the books and with the comic, it really is a question of just like, what does it mean to be good? You know, what would you do? So like the two-pronged questions that people always ask after they finish the books is like what power would you come back with? And what would you do with it? But really, like I said, the question I kind of am circling in this one. So maybe I'll put it this way. I hope people disagree or have conversations about whether or not Charlotte has the ability to make a difference. Because I think that power just like, it sends you, much like time travel in fiction, it can send you into like a really weird thought spiral about like what is autonomy and agency, and do we have it, and is it really a superpower, or is it the worst curse to ever be given? Because like, if you know that your actions don't matter, say you think that they don't matter, can you then choose to ignore them, and by ignoring them risk that they do matter? Like, it's just, I don't think there's a win. I think that she genuinely has the hardest power in the entire vicious world.
It's a hard one.
Like, would you ignore it? Do you just like turn it? She can't turn it off. So like,
yeah, there's a lot of reflective surfaces in the world.
Yeah. And like, are you doing good, or are you simply not seeing bad? Because if all you see is the exact circumstances of one person's death.
Mm.
You can't see any context.
Mm.
Yeah.
We have a question from D. Thomas or Dia Thomas who asks, how did you first realize you love to write?
I just made stuff up all the time. I think I've just never been very good at living in reality. Like what it is, if I am left in quiet, if I am sitting in a room by myself and there are no distractions, I will make up stories in my head. It's just the default. It's like this, I'm an only child. I was like really independent as a kid. And my default in the absence of activity was to make things up.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I didn't necessarily know I was going to be a novelist. Like I was that kid who wrote scripts and then made all their friends act them out. And like drew comics, except I was not good at drawing. I just was always looking for ways to invent, you know, and it's just the thing that makes me feel happy. Like nothing makes me feel happier than a good writing day. Nothing makes me feel whole or satisfied like creating. And like conversely, nothing makes me feel worse than a bad writing day. Nothing makes me feel like more of a failure in my bones because I feel like this is the thing that I love doing. And when I don't do it well, or when I let myself down in that way, even though I know the roller coaster is the roller coaster, I don't know. It's just the thing is like, it really came down to Vicious, right? I hit the point where I asked myself, if no one paid me ever again to do this, what would I do? And the answer was still write a story.
That's nice. We have a question that is, what is your favorite ending that you have written?
Harsh.
I know.
Okay, I will say I really like several of them. I love the last page of Extraordinary because I knew I was going to do it from the first page of Extraordinary. And like, and I haven't necessarily figured out everything about what I've just done to myself by writing that ending. Like I definitely didn't like plan forward, but now I'm going to have to figure it out exactly. The ending of Addie LaRue, which is extremely contentious, but it's my favorite because I didn't start writing the book until I had it. And I'll stand by that ending until the cows come home. And ironically, the ending of Conjuring of Light, which is bad for me because I'm now writing book 4. And Conjuring of Light's the end of the first trilogy in the Shades of Magic series. So no pressure for me. Okay. And see, this is too many, but until you remember, I have like 21, 22 books and then I'm not actually.
It's allowed.
The last, so I don't cry very often at my work. Like I cry out of relief when the act is done, when the exorcism of that draft is over. The ending for Gallant, which is my next novel, which comes out March 1st, made me cry and has made everyone in my family cry. And that made me really happy because, again, one of the reasons that book was 2 years late was because I couldn't find the right ending. And then I did. And it's just like, you just know in your bones when you have it.
I love how much you always love your next novel. I feel like this is something that I've noticed about you, which is really nice.
You have to, because like, what's the point that like, you have to be excited by it, you know, you have to always be reaching. One of the reasons my books are all so different is I just never want anyone to be able to hold them up next to each other and compare apples to apples. So it's never like I'm just trying to be better with each book, though I'm trying to be different. Like I try to set myself a different challenge, and it's not a qualitative challenge, it's just a challenge. And so I get really excited for my next book because it's the one I've set the newest challenge for.
And you mentioned that you almost always or maybe always have the ending for your books, but do you actually write them, or do you like, is that like a reward at the end? It's like, if you get there, you get to write it.
Yeah, I don't write it in advance. I have it like notated. I have it like set. What's really funny is I have the ending for Threads of Power, which is the 4th book in Shades of Magic, but I have 6 endings. So I have like the ending, and then I have 6 optional codas that I'm going to have to figure out which is. So like sometimes I don't always know like exactly what the last page will look like, but I know how we're going to land it.
Do you think that's like a thematic thing? Like how you're going to land the theme, or do you think it's more plot or character or a combination?
Plot. Yeah. It's plot because plot was always my weakness. And so I like made a concerted effort to make it a strength. So
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't worry about character because I feel confident in it. I don't worry about prose because I feel confident in it, but plot is like a paranoia spot for me. And so I like, because I know that it's not the most natural for me,
Mm-hmm.
I like throw myself into it 5 times as hard, and I make sure that the plot ends in a way that I feel excited about.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Janine Irons, who asks, what sort of books do you like to read for pleasure? Who are your favorite authors, and what are you reading now?
I read so many kinds of books. I'm on track to read like 160 this year, which is,
Wow.
I would like to point out that a lot of
You
that
write so many books. How are you doing both of these things?
I would like to point out that it has been like a life avoidance strategy this year. Like, I have definitely developed an unhealthy relationship with my reading list because I think it's just like, I'm just avoiding life. And it's like, oh, well, this is kind of my work. So even if I don't get any other work done, if I read a book, surely that's part of my job. But I read a lot of different things. I don't have any guilty pleasures because I don't believe in guilty pleasures, but I will say I love, because I'm restless. Probably people can tell. I'm a restless soul, and I walk probably 5 to 10 miles a day, which means I always have an audiobook, usually multiple. And there's a lot of books that I'm happy to read, but my favorite to listen to are like nonfiction, memoir, and humor. Like if people go to like the Goodreads Choice Awards right now, if you go to like the humor category, or like the memoir, those are my favorite, usually because they're narrated by the author. Mm-hmm. They're really insightful. They make me smile, and I can listen to them like when I'm on a 5-mile walk. And so I am always reading something that I feel I want to like touch the words, but then I'm listening to something where it feels like the voice, like Stanley Tucci narrating Taste. I can't not think like that was like 2 of the happiest like walking days for me, because like it's like a hug. I literally finished 15 minutes before we started an upcoming novel by an author I adore named Jess Kidd, who wrote Things in Jars and Himself. Her next novel is called The Night Ship, which comes out next year, and I got my hands on the advanced copy. Before that, I was listening to Between Two Kingdoms, which was up for nonfiction this year in the Goodreads Choice Awards. I honestly I look forward to the Goodreads Choice Awards each year because it's how I build my end of year, like, what should I be reading that I haven't already found list.
You need like guidance.
Exactly. Or like if something somehow slipped through my radar, like I'm like, oh, how did I not hear about that? And so I usually have like, I'm looking at my TBR stack across the room that's all galleys. Mm-hmm. So I'm usually being asked to read a lot of things for work. Mm-hmm. But I always try, and I'm like a very defiant galley reader. So I'll end up reading something that came out I'm also listening to a book that came out in the 70s. So like, I am just an ornery reader.
Mm-hmm. There's so much. Yeah. There's so much out there.
I can't keep up. I genuinely, how can I read 160 books a year and still not keep up with a drop?
There's always more, and there's something nice about that.
It's very stressful.
You're like, no. I think this is probably going to be our last question. It's from Jessica Baker, and she asks, what is an underrated tip that you've got for writers, and or what do you wish younger you knew? Which I think are different questions, but maybe have some overlap.
I can answer both of them. I mean, because I think the first part's easier for me. If you are struggling at all, 2 things, which is to find an ending. Like I've said several times here, if you can find an ending that excites you, I promise it turns the desert of a first draft into a football field. Like, it's still a long distance, but it's something you can cross. You can see the end of it. I also think, like, stop fetishizing word count. Like, it just does not matter how fast you write. I would so much rather aspiring writers put in an hour and do good work than worry about getting that extra 500 words that they're only getting because it will take them to an arbitrary metric, and maybe they're not excited about those words. Like, I measure time. I gave up measuring word count a couple of years ago because it was driving me crazy and I wasn't happy. I was like, why am I caring? Like, I'm at 1,900 words. Now I'm going to make up 100 I don't even feel strongly about to hit that goal. It does not matter how fast you get those words down. As long as you don't quit, you will end up with something. Like, it might take you 6 months. It might take you a year. It doesn't need to take you a month. it like the story will happen at the pace that the story is going to happen, and you will enjoy yourself more if you don't measure the words of it. So yeah, like just, and also break it down into the smallest metric possible. Like there are days when I sit down and I'm so daunted by the idea of starting that like I'll set my timer for 5 or 10 minutes instead of 20 or 30. And so I'm like, for the next 5 minutes, I'm not even allowed to type anything. I'm just going to think. I'm just going to make some scribbles, make some notes, just think, just like break the seal on it. Like if you struggle with anxiety or depression, or if you just struggle with finishing something, or you struggle with starting, which I find starting to be a lot harder, to be honest. Every single day feels like that little hurdle. Just like take a bite. Like remember, whatever you're writing, you're not writing the whole of it. You're writing a line. You're writing a paragraph, maybe a page. Like those are much more manageable. Like just make the bites as small as possible.
Okay. Is that what you wish the younger you knew as well?
I was obsessed with being taken seriously, and I was obsessed with finishing, and I was obsessed with being prolific, and I made myself measure everything. Like I was very, very obsessed with the metrics of it, and I would get really lost in that instead of the joy of creating. And like one of the things I've been working on this year as I work on Threads of Power is just like enjoying the writing process. And that means like taking the time and not beating myself up. And like, if I stop measuring it, then you know what happens? I look back at the end of the month, I wrote as many words as I would have written if I was measuring word count, which is to say, but I felt better about it because I enjoyed it more. Maybe some days I'll write 600 words and some days I'll write 2000, and it just like, it evens out the way it needs to even out.
I think that's good advice.
Yeah.
You know, Vengeful or Vicious is the first book of yours that I ever read.
Really?
And so it has a special place in my heart. But I think a lot of people who are watching probably, love this world and this series. And I was wondering if there's anything you could tease about Victorious, or what people have to look forward to.
I mean, here's what I'll say.
Okay.
I get asked a lot about which characters appear in my future books. And when people ask me that for something like Shades of Magic, it's like, well, if a character's dead, they're probably not going to come back in the future books. What I'll say about the books in this series is that like death doesn't really stick to these characters very well. Like they have a habit of shaking it off. So I'm always fascinated when people postulate about Victorious and they like are very confident about which characters will not be in it. And I'm like, why? Because they died? Like characters are dying.
You're like, they all died already.
That's
once.
What they do. They're literally coming back from the dead. So what I would say is like, keep an open mind to who will be in that book.
Okay. Interesting. I'll take it. Oh, thank you so much, Victoria.
I just want to point out, now they're asleep. It's so rude.
This is a full story.
There. I should at least get some advertising out of this.
Yes, they're definitely your best assets right now.
So rude.
They're so cute. So I want to also thank Barnes & Noble for making this conversation happen, and for all of you for listening and for submitting such interesting questions. I am Kayti Burt, and you can find me at denofgeek.com where I write, or follow me at Twitter at Kayti Burt, KaytyBurt. And where is the best place for people to find you, Victoria?
People can find me on Instagram at VE Schwab, just all one word. It's very basic.
You're a good Instagrammer. I like your Instagram.
Oh, thank you. Well, these days it's just cat content. Like,
that's all we need. Keeps us going. And, everyone who's attending tonight did get the Extraordinary exclusive signed edition, which is very cool. But if you need any additional copies, maybe for the holidays or other reasons, they are available at 24/7 at barnesandnoble.com or at your local Barnes & Noble stores, as are other, Victoria Schwab books, which I also highly recommend.
Just a few.
So I want to thank you again, Victoria, and thank all of you. And I hope everyone has a good night and a good week.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.